accuse me of vanity, but I intend what I have just said to be praise of the princess and not of my work. For even if it be misguided, it is still a great thing that such a princess, surrounded by everything that can dissipate the spirit, gives so much attention to matters as elevated as those treated of in my work. From one perspective, I suppose it might seem surprising that in the midst of the rush of changes that were overtaking her, Caroline should have wanted to take time to read through the Theodicy once more. But from another perspective, it seems a perfectly natural thing for her to want to do. I think it was precisely because she was surrounded, as Leibniz put it, by everything that can dissipate the spirit that she sought solace once more in a book and in a friend that had seen her through so many difficult times in the past. As she later told Leibniz in a letter of 10 January 1716, in which she had enclosed Clarke's second paper, I was not able to prevent myself from saying to Dr. Clarke that your opinion appeared to me to be the most fitting to the perfection of God, and that all philosophy which sought to alienate me from it appeared to me to be imperfect. Since in my view it, that is philosophy, was done or ought to be studied in order to soothe us and to strengthen us against ourselves and against everything that assails us from the outside. For sentimental as well as substantive reasons, Caroline was enthralled with the Theodicy. She used it as the standard against which philosophy for her was to be measured, telling Leibniz that she thought the works of Dr. Clarke, quote, contain much that is good, although I do not find the Theodicy in him. Again, in her letter of 10 January 1716, after noting that her friend, the Bishop of Lincoln, William Wake, had just been elevated to the Archbishopric of Canterbury, and that he had talked with her that very day about what she referred to as your wonderful Theodicy, she added that after his installation is done, we are thinking of having it translated. And then she ended with this trumpet of praise for the Theodicy. I am completely blessed to have the same views as this great man, who finds that the more this book is read, the more it is found incomparable. The fondness I have for this book reminds me of another bishop who was said to love being admired by the greatest ignoramuses. I expect that you have the same view. Thus you ought to be very pleased to be admired by as great an ignoramus as I. But the truth moves the ignorant as well as the most wise, and this is what I took the liberty of saying to the late Electress Sophie, who pretended not to be able to understand it. I have noted that in her letter of 10 January 1716, Caroline mentions that she and Archbishop William Wake were thinking of having the Theodicy translated into English. But this was by no means the first mention of the Theodicy translation project in the letters that were exchanged between Leibniz and Caroline after her arrival in England. Indeed, the first mention of the project in the extant correspondence occurs in a letter that Leibniz wrote to Caroline more than 9 months earlier, on 29 March 1715, scarcely more than 5 months after Caroline had landed at Margate, Kent, on 22 October 1714. A letter from Caroline that Leibniz was answering is apparently lost, but from Leibniz's reply we know that it concerned, at least in part, feelers that Caroline had sent out to the Bishop of Bristol, George Smallridge, concerning Leibniz's Theodicy. For Leibniz begins his letter by thanking Caroline for sending him the letter that the bishop wrote to her concerning his Theodicy. The bishop had apparently found the Theodicy obscure, since Leibniz replies a bit defensively, and as if it were a compliment, or at least an adequate response, by pointing out that, quote, it does not appear that my book is thought to be obscure in France, or more obscure than the books of Father Malebranche and others that are quite in fashion. He then went on to say that when the Paris edition, which is in 12 is sold out, they are thinking of publishing another edition of it there with some additions. I would then explain the Latin and Greek citations, and if a genuine obscurity is pointed out to me, I will try to clarify it. Leibniz was sufficiently stung by the bishop's remarks to have included with his letter a separate 3-page response that focused exclusively on the bishop's charge of obscurity. That Caroline's letter and her contact with the Bishop of Bristol was concerned with a project to have the Theodicy translated into English is made clear enough in the P.S. that Leibniz appended to his own letter. I believe he wrote that Monsieur de la Roche would be suitable for translating my book. He is a refugee clergyman who has published a kind of journal in English entitled Memoirs of Literature. It is true that I would prefer an Anglican theologian undertake its translation. It is noteworthy that Leibniz reveals no hint here of having been previously unaware of the fact that Caroline was engaged in an attempt to have the Theodicy translated into English. And it appears that Caroline had mentioned in her letter and hence was previously aware of Leibniz's preference for a translator who was an Anglican theologian. This strongly suggests that the project was actually discussed before Caroline left Germany for England, and there seems no more likely time for the conversation to have taken place than during that month-long stay at Herrenhausen when Leibniz and Caroline were reading through the Theodicy together before her departure for England. It would, in fact, have been extremely odd if the idea hadn't come up under the circumstances, for what could have been more natural under the circumstances than for Caroline to think of having her favorite book by her very close friend translated into the language of her new realm, a language that she had been studying in preparation for her role as a part of the royal family of England. Leibniz would certainly have had every reason to encourage the idea, and it is not inconceivable that at Herrenhausen he had already been thinking about how the translation project might eventually serve him in his war against the Newtonians. Allowing for the time it usually took for letters to be exchanged between England and the continent, as well as for the time it must have taken for Caroline's letter of inquiry to reach the Bishop of Bristol, for him to compose a reply, and for this reply to return to Caroline. Caroline's inquiry could scarcely have been made much later than the end of February 1715, that is, scarcely more than 4 months after her arrival in England. Given how much of her initial time in England would have been given over to ceremonies of state and establishing her household, Caroline must have turned to the task of sounding out the Bishop of Bristol on the matter of the Theodicy at her earliest possible convenience. When she had disembarked at Margate, she was, I think, already prepared to act. The next word that Leibniz received from Caroline after his letter of 29 March 1715 was actually sent to him through Henrietta Charlotta von Pulnitz, who had been Sophie Charlotta's lady of the chamber. Pulnitz quoted Caroline as follows: "I am reading the books of Locke. The one on the understanding seems fine, but as ignorant as I am, I would think that there would be something to say in response, and I believe that Monsieur Leibniz will be of my opinion. Please tell him that I will not respond to him until the king grants me the position that he seeks." The position to which Caroline refers here is that of historiographer of Great Britain, which Leibniz had requested in his very first letter to her after her arrival in England. In his response of 10 May, Leibniz informed Caroline for the first time of the priority dispute between himself and Newton over the discovery of the calculus. He tried to justify his request for the position of historiographer by pointing out that Newton had been given a comparable position as warden of the mint. He argued that rewarding him the position of historiographer would make him the equal of Newton and thereby give honor to Hanover and Germany in his person, having previously suggested that Newton and his followers were rigid and not very favorable to the party of Hanover. But realizing perhaps that Caroline had neither the expertise nor the interest to enter into a dispute about the calculus on his behalf, Leibniz went on to ridicule Newton's notion of gravity and then to link him with an alleged anti-Hanoverian faction bent on discrediting the Lutheran religion and the doctrine of the Eucharist. "It is true," he wrote, "that some friends are urging me to examine for myself the philosophy of Monsieur Newton, which is pretty extraordinary. He claims that a body attracts another at whatever distance it may be, and that a grain of sand on the earth exerts an attractive force even upon the sun, without any medium or means. After that, will these sectarians attempt to deny that by the omnipotence of God we can share in the body and blood of Jesus Christ without any impediment of distance? It is a good way to embarrass them, the men who, from an animus against the house of Hanover, now free themselves more than ever to speak against our religion of the Confession of Augsburg, as if our extraordinary and miraculous Eucharistic reality were absurd. For my part, I believe that it is proper to reserve a function for the divine mysteries and not to introduce them into the explanation of natural things." Although he does not mention the Theodicy here, Leibniz may well have meant to remind Caroline of section 19 of the preliminary dissertation of the Theodicy, where he had also discussed Newton's notion of gravity in connection with the Lutheran doctrine of the Eucharist. In the Theodicy, however, Leibniz had not gone so far as to try to connect Newton with an anti-Hanoverian and anti-Lutheran faction. That he went further in his letter to Caroline is, I think, a reflection of the fact that he had by then decided that in his fight against Newton and his followers, it might be possible to gain leverage by exploiting Caroline's partisan favor for the Hanoverian succession, the Lutheran religion, and the Theodicy. In the postscript to his letter of 10 May, Leibniz also addressed Caroline's remarks about